In the early hours of December 16, 1944, before dawn had any chance to soften the frozen darkness, the Ardennes Forest came alive with thunder. It began not with speeches or warnings, but with sound, a rolling concussion that tore through the stillness of winter in Belgium and Luxembourg. German artillery opened fire across a wide front, shells slamming into American positions that only hours earlier had seemed quiet and secure. This was the opening of what history would call the Battle of the Bulge, the last great gamble of Adolf Hitler and the German Wehrmacht in World War II. Snow lay deep among the trees, fog clung to the valleys, and visibility was so poor that even seasoned soldiers struggled to understand what was happening around them. The Ardennes Awakening had begun, and it would shock the Allied forces to their core. For months, the Ardennes sector had been considered a rest area, a place where battered American divisions could recover. Many units stationed there were inexperienced, understrength, or recently arrived from the United States. Intelligence reports had dismissed the region as unlikely ground for a major German offensive. Yet as the first shells landed, it became clear that the enemy had returned in force. German panzer divisions surged forward behind the barrage, using the dense forest and winter weather to conceal their movement. Roads clogged with armor and infantry pushing westward, aiming to split the Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. The German Ardennes offensive relied on speed, surprise, and the hope that the Allies would crumble before they could react. American soldiers awoke to chaos. Communication lines were severed. Forward observers were cut off. Command posts were overrun in the confusion. Entire regiments found themselves surrounded before they understood the scale of the attack. The fog was so thick that air support, one of the Allies' greatest advantages, was grounded. In foxholes and hastily dug positions, American infantry faced waves of German troops advancing through the snow, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. Artillery units struggled to respond as maps became unreliable and targets disappeared into the white landscape. This was not a slow probing attack. It was a full-scale offensive launched along more than 80 miles of front. The German High Command had committed its remaining reserves, including elite formations such as the 6th Panzer Army. Their goal was nothing less than to change the course of the war in the West. For the American forces, December 1944 became a test of endurance and resolve. Units like the 99th Infantry Division and the 106th Infantry Division were hit hardest in the opening hours. Many soldiers had never experienced combat on this scale. Some positions collapsed under the weight of the assault, while others held stubbornly, buying precious time with heavy losses. Roads became choked with refugees, retreating units, and supply convoys struggling to move through icy conditions. German artillery fire was relentless, using traditional time-fused shells that burst at ground level or buried themselves uselessly in snow. Still, the pressure was overwhelming as German infantry infiltrated through gaps in the lines. Confusion spread. Rumors of enemy paratroopers and disguised soldiers sowed panic behind the front. American commanders worked desperately to regain control, often relying on fragmentary reports and instinct rather than clear intelligence. This was the moment the Germans had been waiting for since Normandy. Yet even as the situation deteriorated, something else was stirring within the Allied command structure. Unknown to most of the soldiers fighting and dying in the Ardennes, a closely guarded scientific breakthrough existed, locked away by strict orders and fear of capture. It was a weapon born of laboratories and factories rather than training grounds, a technological innovation that promised to change artillery warfare itself. At this stage of the Battle of the Bulge, it remained unused, restricted to a handful of trusted commanders and select theaters. But as German forces pushed deeper and the American defenses bent under the strain, the conditions that would force its release were rapidly taking shape. The frozen forests of the Ardennes had awakened not only an enemy offensive, but a turning point in military history. As German infantry pressed relentlessly forward in the days following December 16, 1944, the situation along several sectors of the Ardennes front grew desperate. By December 17th and 18th, American artillery positions were firing almost continuously, their gun crews exhausted and their ammunition stocks dwindling. Near key road junctions and ridgelines, U.S. artillery commanders watched through binoculars as waves of German soldiers advanced through snow-covered fields and dense forest, using terrain and weather as protection. Conventional artillery fire, reliant on impact bursts or timed detonations, struggled to stop them. Shells that hit the frozen ground often buried themselves harmlessly or exploded to low, their fragments absorbed by snow and earth. Infantry units clinging to defensive positions began to report that German troops were closing in despite sustained bombardment. It was in this moment of crisis that a commander made a decision that would alter the Battle of the Bulge forever. The American forces had a secret weapon known only to a select few. It was the proximity fuse, officially designated the variable time fuse, a marvel of wartime science. For months it had been kept under strict control. Allied leaders feared that if one fell into German hands, it could be reverse-engineered and used against Allied aircraft or troops. Orders limited its use, and many artillery officers had never even seen one. But as German pressure mounted near a critical sector of the front, a U.S. artillery commander faced a stark choice: continue firing conventional shells and risk being overrun, or break protocol and deploy the forbidden technology. Acting without higher authorization, he chose the latter. This was not an act of recklessness, but of calculated defiance born from necessity. The proximity fuse worked unlike anything artillery crews had used before. Instead of detonating on impact or after a preset time, it used miniature radar principles to sense the distance to the ground. When the shell reached an optimal height above the target, it exploded in midair. In theory, this would scatter lethal fragments downward over exposed infantry, bypassing foxholes, shallow trenches, and natural cover. Until that moment, it had remained largely theoretical to most soldiers. Now it was about to be tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. As the first shells fitted with proximity fuses were loaded into American artillery pieces, crews were tense and uncertain. There was no dramatic announcement. No one shouted that history was about to be made. The guns fired as they always had, recoiling in the cold air. Seconds later, something extraordinary happened. Instead of dull thuds or muffled explosions in the snow, sharp bursts erupted above the advancing German formations. Steel fragments rained down from the sky. Soldiers caught in the open were struck from above, where helmets and winter gear offered little protection. Units that moments earlier had advanced confidently now faltered, then broke. German officers later reported confusion and shock, believing at first that they were under air attack. But Allied aircraft were still grounded by fog. This was artillery transformed. The effect was immediate and devastating. German infantry assault stalled, then collapsed under the unexpected barrage. Survivors scrambled for deeper cover, only to find that the airbursts negated the protection of terrain. American infantry, watching from their positions, saw the enemy halted where earlier fire had failed. Morale surged. Word spread quickly along the lines that something new had entered the fight. For the artillery commander who gave the unauthorized order, there was no time to reflect. The battle was still raging and survival came first. Yet his defiant choice marked a turning point not just in that sector, but in the wider Battle of the Bulge. Reports of the effectiveness of the proximity fuse traveled rapidly up the chain of command. Field officers sent urgent messages describing how German attacks had been shattered by airburst artillery. These accounts reached higher headquarters, where the grim reality of the Ardennes offensive was already clear. Allied lines were bent but not broken. Every advantage mattered. The success of the secret weapon could not be ignored. What began as a single act of battlefield necessity would soon reshape Allied artillery doctrine. In the frozen forests of Belgium, science had met desperation, and the result was decisive. By late December 1944, as snow continued to blanket the Ardennes and the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the true nature of the new weapon began to emerge. The proximity fuse was not a sudden invention born of desperation. It was the result of years of intense scientific effort that began long before American forces landed in Normandy. Before the United States entered World War II, military researchers understood a fundamental weakness in traditional artillery. Even the most accurate guns could not guarantee lethal effects against entrenched infantry. By the final days of December 1944, the dramatic results of the new artillery weapon could no longer be contained within isolated after-action reports. News of shattered German assaults and unexpectedly effective firepower reached Allied high command at an alarming pace. Senior commanders, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower headquarters, were already grappling with the scale of the German Ardennes offensive. Bastogne was surrounded, supply lines were strained. Weather continued to ground Allied air power. In this environment, the proximity fuse was no longer a risky experiment. It was a proven solution. Restrictions that had once limited its use were lifted, and orders went out to deploy the fuse widely across the Battle of the Bulge. Artillery units throughout the front began receiving shipments with clear instructions. Use it against enemy infantry. Use it against counterattacks. Use it wherever German troops attempted to mass. The defense of Bastogne became one of the most iconic moments of the campaign, and proximity-fused artillery played a critical role even before skies cleared for airdrops. Surrounded American units relied heavily on artillery to keep German forces at bay. When German infantry attempted to close in through forests and open fields, airburst shells broke their formations again and again. Foxholes became death traps rather than shelter. German commanders found it increasingly difficult to concentrate forces for decisive attacks. Every movement risked sudden destruction from above. As January 1945 approached, the weather finally improved. Allied aircraft returned to the skies, compounding the pressure on German units already battered by artillery. The proximity fuse did not replace air power or armor, but it filled a vital gap at the moment when it mattered most. During the Allied counteroffensive, as American and British forces pushed back into the bulge created by the German advance, proximity-fused artillery supported assaults and defensive actions alike. German troops, already short on fuel and ammunition, now faced an enemy whose artillery seemed impossibly accurate and devastating. Momentum shifted decisively. The German offensive stalled, then collapsed. By late January, the front had largely returned to its previous positions. Hitler's final gamble in the West had failed. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a single decisive blow, but with the cumulative effect of resilience, logistics, air power, and a secret weapon finally revealed. In the aftermath, Allied analysts assessed the impact of the proximity fuse and reached a clear conclusion. It had saved countless lives by shortening engagements and breaking enemy attacks more quickly. It had also permanently changed artillery doctrine. No longer was artillery solely about hitting the ground. Control of the air above the battlefield became just as important. The lessons learned in the Ardennes would influence military planning for decades. After the war, the technology behind the proximity fuse evolved into more advanced systems, shaping modern munitions and air defense. Yet its first decisive land use remained tied to the frozen forests of December 1944. The secret weapon that helped halt Germany's final offensive was not a new tank or aircraft, but a small device hidden inside an artillery shell. Its story is a reminder that history often turns on unseen innovations, released only when desperation demands courage.